Old school RuneScape and all of the design choices I dislike about it. Number 1, the Grand Exchange. The Grand Exchange killed trade and produced a passive income machine for any player with minimal requirements for interaction and knowledge. Much like the same practices in reality, this design leads to inflation and centralization of wealth, increasing price disparity and decreasing the viability of several options for wealth acquisition within RuneScape. I don't want to talk about the Grand Exchange excessively, so I'll make this section very brief, especially considering how damaging I believe it is to player interaction and decision making. The existence of the Grand Exchange instantly produces a cascade of middlemen for every item and makes acquiring a valuable item through any other means undesirable in comparison unless the item in question exceeds the value limit of the Grand Exchange or is itself acquirable only through other means. Number 2, bonds. Bonds are the only Jagex approved form of real-world trading currently in old-school RuneScape at the time of writing this script. Bonds are an attempt by Jagex to combat real-world trade and allow players to purchase in-game time via in-game currency. This system is unfavorable for players for 2 reasons. Maintaining a membership at the cost of in-game currency slows or halts account progress with regards to gear and supplies, and unless an extraordinary amount of time is spent playing or in-game decisions are restricted to optimal choices, then bank value stagnates, and coupled with the price of in-game gear being orders of magnitude greater, accounts that purchase membership via bonds are doomed to stagnate, unless the account owner progresses in a very particular way. This system also favors bot farms because new methods of botting can be scouted with less risk to a bot farm. Over-centralizing content. Zulrah, Zenyte Shards, Tormented Synapse. All of these have one thing in common. On the release of Zulrah, the drop table included the Tanzanite and Magic Fangs and Visage as rare rewards from fighting the boss. These items could then be crafted into 4 different items, being the Toxic Blowpipe, Serpentine Helm, Toxic Trident, and Toxic Staff of the Dead. Zulrah was, at the time, also the best consistent GP per hour of any activity in old school RuneScape. Crucially, the products of these items were also best in slot in every style. Almost every piece of content in the entire game was made less desirable by the release of a single enemy. People would spend hours upon hours exclusively at Zulrah because every player wanted multiple fangs and the consistent value from the standard drop table far surpassed anything before it. The drop table of Zulrah also covered many skills with large quantities of necessary items, including farming, prayer, and crafting. The combination of the factors of consistent gold value, best-in-slot gear, and skill variety made this one enemy a highly centralizing piece of content that was subsequently nerfed many times. Zenyte Shards are another item that has a similar centralizing effect. The Zenyte Shard is a 1 out of 300 drop from demonic gorillas according to the wiki that is used to produce what at the time was the best-in-slot jewelry for every style. At the time of writing this script, I have 1,297 demonic gorilla kills, and I have received precisely 1 Zenyte Shard. If I were playing an Iron Man, the most reasonable option at this stage of my account would be to skip tasks and get Black Demon tasks and camp demonic gorillas until I have 3 more of these. This is definitionally centralizing content. Tormented Synapses are a more recent addition to this family of items and one that is less overbearing in its particular effects. Because the Demon Bane weapons are only particularly useful against demonic creatures, there's an interplay between acquiring synapses and acquiring shards, but they are fundamentally very similar in both mode of acquisition and style of combat, and once again cover every style from the drop table of a single enemy. These arguments could be similarly applied to the Dagannoth Kings and Pest Control, except for the fact that upon the release of the Dagannoth Kings, there were no other sources of offensive combat rings, and the Void Knight equipment is only best in slot for specific encounters due to its low defense and the nature of its percentage-based bonuses. These types of content cover such a wide variety of activities from such a centralizing point that they are borderline necessary for progression of characters. I did not mention the Gauntlet or Corrupted Gauntlet here for a few reasons. Primarily because the Corrupted Gauntlet's item output does not cover every style of combat, and secondarily because the items it produces are not strictly best in slot even upon release. Those who view Corrupted Gauntlet as overly centralizing are most likely Iron Men, who must obtain several rare drops from CG for them to serve their purpose. Demonic Gorillas are similarly centralizing for Iron Men specifically, however both of these pale in comparison to Zulrah at the time of its release, being the single most centralizing activity in the entirety of RuneScape, while simultaneously being a single-player instanced encounter. Skilling bosses and minigames. I'd like to preface this section by emphasizing that I enjoy Wintertodt and Guardians of the Rift, and my personal gripe with these isn't due to any individual piece of content, but rather what they represent. Wintertodt was the first release of this form of content, taking a skill that was primarily a boring money fire and turning it into a semi-interactive activity with decent rewards across a variety of skills. Ultimately, however, what the release of Wintertodt, Temperos, Mastering Mixology, Hallowed Sepulchre, Blast Furnace, and Veil Totems give us is a variety of skilling activities that are each individually linked to one primary skill with small amounts of experience gained in secondary skills. Instead of a fun and interactive minigame utilizing skilling activities to participate in group collaboration or competition, each of these essentially boils down to one small gameplay loop with a fresh coat of paint. There's some variety in in-game mechanics, but none so significant as to overshadow the collect, modify, and expend loop of each of these activities. These options are primarily directed at players who prioritize optimization and consistency over a variety of gameplay and active interaction. Fundamentally, none of these activities are actually even multiplayer at all, requiring little to no coordination or interaction between players. I personally solo both Wintertodt and Temperos preferentially due to the only difference being a minimization of variance. None of these design choices are particularly disagreeable, however they occupy a tier of experience value and gold value that will from now on be direct competition for any forms of more fun and engaging content. If we are ever to see a minigame like Stealing Creation or any other kind of multiplayer interactive training method, each of these individual minigames will necessarily be competing for player count and motivation for their respective skills at all times. Number 5, and now we're getting onto the ones that I really want to talk about, money printers and drop tables. One of the single worst designed pieces of content in the entire game at the time of writing this script is the Wilderness Agility Course rework. The Wilderness Agility course currently stands as one of the largest influxes of raw currency into the entire game, and it is far from the only offender. Beneficially, the Wilderness Agility course draws large crowds to specific areas of the wilderness to promote player interaction. Initially following release, this area was a risky but fun way to get a couple agility levels while earning some GP. In the years that followed, however, the only way to actually utilize this area is en masse through secretive clans focused on defending the crowd in order to gain maximum reward from what is ostensibly a giant money printer. At least with the release of Zulrah, very little GP was directly poured into the game economy through the boss alone. The secondary effects of the stronger items certainly caused more gold to enter the game, however the boss itself didn't produce a large amount of coins directly, so the drops acted more as a mode of transportation of currency than a direct production of it. Every large variant of the 3 wilderness bosses drop stacks of noted rune, mystic, and/or dragon items that serve no purpose other than to be used as rag items for player killing or directly alchemized, and since in most cases they will be alchemized, this results in a significant amount of inflation to the economy. In my opinion, every powered staff released after the Trident and most of the other gear released should have required coins in addition to their respective rune costs to upkeep, and many activities currently in the game should in some way or another remove GP from the game directly, because the value of GP in the player economy has been widening the gap between the value of items for a long period of time. The Grand Exchange attempts to combat this problem by implementing both an item sink in the form of the buyback quotas and a gold sink in the form of a tax, but the reality is that much of this content that has been released is performed consistently and constantly by robots because this game is overrun with degenerate tools and bad actors. User interface optimization. Because of the options provided by RuneLite and similar clients, the choice between optimization and actual gameplay is something that many players must actively contend with, and several pieces of content are directly designed around plugins, making the gameplay experience undesirable for anyone who wants to experience actually playing the video game instead of looking at a screen covered in text and timers while clicking on colorful numbered tiles in sequence. RuneScape has almost always been a game that leaned heavily on outside tools like the wiki and YouTube, but over the years, the combination of and expectation of reliance on these information sources, client plugins, and the existence of massive amounts of false players have made not using these tools prohibitively detrimental to the point where only a select few players forgo them in their entirety, and most players are stuck in a battle between optimization and enjoyment. There's also a constant lack of debate over what is considered fair play with regards to these tools, and the usage of them has made areas like the wilderness completely ridiculous. Giant logout buttons constantly moused over with secondary accounts positioned around an active player, each with flashing warning signs should another player ever become rendered. Mega rares and gear progression. Many of the items released in conjunction with their respective raids are simply so far and above the options that preceded them that if their items are not best in slot for a very long time, then power creep is not only inevitable, but imminent. Some of these items are directly comparable to the form that legendary items took in classic World of Warcraft. The Twisted Bow is an absolutely ludicrous upgrade from anything that came before it, and the design of many of the items released is antithetical to the aesthetic style of old school RuneScape in its glory days. Looking at the stats of something like Masori F gear doesn't immediately clue you into the fact of how much stronger it actually is, until you realize that each piece of the Masori F set completely outclasses every piece of ranged equipment that preceded it in not only accuracy, but also strength and defense. Instead of using Void Knight equipment, you will use Masori. Instead of using Carols, you will use Masori. Instead of using Armadillo armor, you will use Masori in almost every situation. For many players, this doesn't seem like an issue because for many players, it isn't an issue. What I dislike about this the most is once again the centralization aspect. There's no reason to use any other ranged gear because Masori provides range strength and the same prayer bonus as Armadillo armor with higher defenses than Carol's equipment without ever needing to be repaired. Concurrently with this shift from varied itemization to singular sets is a change in artistic style that I never wanted to see in RuneScape. Instead of the variety of outfits for different situations, gear choice has become staled with edgy cool outfits like Torva and Masori, and while you still sometimes see cuties in red outfits with obsidian capes, you can also easily find 100 identical accounts in a single area. Every world is full of accounts in identical gear doing the exact same thing at Rune Dragons, Vedian, Nex, etc. In many cases within RuneScape, there is simply an optimal set of items to use for a given situation. However, this is not always the case, and there are also some times where I run into the Venenatus Cave to see 2 other players with 3 different gear sets between us, and get to meet actual active players.